Welcome, everybody. Welcome to tonight's presentation of the Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones chapter. Wild Ones, as you know, is we promote environmentally sound landscaping practices to preserve biodiversity through the preservation, restoration, and establishment of the native plant communities. That's a mouthful. For tonight's event, I wish to remind everyone that they can go ahead and use the chat feature to ask questions or to make any comments. Also, please stay muted throughout the event so that we are able to hear our presenter tonight. And if you're interested in joining, if you're not a member of Wild One yet, and you're interested in joining, please go to our website at Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Paul, who will introduce our presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. Our speaker this evening was scheduled to give a program for us a couple years ago, and unfortunately had to cancel at the last minute due to a family emergency. So we're pleased to have been able to reschedule her to give this talk this evening. She has a distinguished and long-standing reputation for her knowledge of invasive species in the state of Michigan, both on how to deal with them and information about new and potential threats. She holds degrees from Central Michigan University and the University of Michigan and has been an environmental consultant and currently is employed by the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, where she holds the title, where she's worked for 30 years and holds the title of Senior Conservation Scientist. She is the author of numerous papers, mostly dealing with invasive species, and had given several talks on that topic. And so without further delay, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Phyllis Higman, whose talk is titled Biodiversity Matters, What is Up with Invasive Species? Phyllis?
Well, it's such a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'm sorry I couldn't make it a couple years ago. And I'm sorry tonight that we can't be outside. I would much rather be outside than inside. I'm going a little stir crazy. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to talk a little bit about biodiversity and invasive species. And I work for the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And we are part of MSU Extension, although our offices are downtown in Constitution Hall and Lansing with the DNR and Eagle. But our administrator is at MSU Extension. I have a ton of people that have helped me learn what I know about invasive plants, and I have to tell you that I never ever wanted to work with invasive plants. But since our work is about going around the state and finding high quality native communities, and I was going back to them and discovering that they were being invaded, there was no way to avoid working on invasive plants. So I'm going to go through, we'll take a little walk at the beginning, and that kind of bring us to my idea about the context for managing invasive species. I'll do a little refresher on what seems to be the prevalent knowledge to date on invasive species 101. I'm just going to talk a little bit about control, because it's easy to make mistakes. We don't have time to do a lot on that. And then I'll end with a good news story. And then if we have time, I'll go through some priority species that you may or may not be familiar with yet. And feel free to just let me know if somebody has a question that I can answer during the presentation. So I have high objectives for you all. I'd like you to be able to describe biodiversity to your friends when you're done and include the important role of plants. Should be able to explain what an invasive species is not and why it's important to manage them, or if you disagree with managing them. You should be able to describe the invasion curve and how that provides a framework for us to think about managing invasive species. Very importantly, if you don't already have the Mizzen app, if there's nothing else that you get out of tonight's visit, that if you could report any new invaders when you see them, because this is key to us doing a good job in the state. And then I know this group probably already has a ton of ways that you're helping boost Michigan's amazing biodiversity, but if you find another one, that's a great thing. So Michigan Natural Features Inventory maintains a database on the most vulnerable elements of biodiversity in Michigan. We track 420 plants, 302 animals, 77 natural communities. We have a diverse program. We have ecologists, botanists, zoologists, aquatic zoologists, conservation educators, conservation planning, and then we have a whole unit devoted specifically to technology, GIS, and our database biotics. I have to tell you that our work is mostly grant funded. That's not an easy road to hoe. I write grants every day and I'm tired of it. But I've had the very good fortune of getting to travel around and see a lot of the state and learn about what is going on in the state. We have currently 17 full-time staff, 3 AmeriCorps members, and we'll be hiring additional seasonals as grants allow. Here's what we look like. And this was, I think, a year ago at the Fall Extension Conference up in Traverse City. And I can tell you those smiles on our faces are all fake. We don't want to be at the conference. We want to be out in the woods. So let's get out there. So let's take a walk in this Mesic Southern Forest. You might know it better as a beech maple forest. And how would I know that? You might be able to recognize this tree right here has the smooth gray bark of a beech tree. Probably can't see the sugar maples in the background, but this plant right up front here is spice bush. You won't find spice bush in oak hickory forest, but you will find it here in this mesic forest. And why do you think we're going to this forest? We're going to see the spring wildflowers. They are peeking up. Hepatica I've seen. I just saw bloodroot uncurling the other day. Spring beauty's been up for a while, and I haven't seen a trout lily yet, but I'm sure it's out there pretty soon. And then we also came across a trillium. No surprise. But as I was working to put this talk together, I got this email about a new publication that says, "Let us now praise the tiny ants." And I'm like, oh my goodness. I forgot about the ants that are part of this ecosystem. Oops. And there's a picture of the ants carrying the trillium seed to disperse it. They'll take it back to their nest. It has some tasty tidbits called eliosomes on it. And that's how that plant gets dispersed. Just a little ways further into the woods, we come across a vernal pool, and here we find our famous skunk cabbage. This is quite an ornate little plant there with the spathe and the spadix with all the flowers inside. I've heard that this is really loved by black bears. This is an amazing plant. It has early spring adaptations so that it can generate body heat to melt the snow around it. And so that's why it's one of the first to come out in the springtime. And not soon after, the leaves start to unfurl. Last year it was on 4-8. They were already this big. And they keep getting bigger and bigger, and they're adapted to gathering sunlight on that big surface to make their energy while the canopy is still gone. And later in the season in that same woods, you won't see any of those plants anymore. They've done their thing and we're on to different species. We have one more stop. Oops, we're going to walk through the woods and look at some of the critters that live there. The plants make homes for all kinds of organisms, snags for birds. Lots of insects live in this dead and down wood. Here we have an owl peeking out. And we can't forget about the decomposers. What would we do without them? So on our way out, we're going to go by another little vernal pool, and let's take some time to go sit there and stare into that water. It looks like an innocent little puddle full of leaves. But the longer you look at that, pretty soon you'll start to see there is a whole community of thriving organisms that make that their home because of the specific landscape in the region. And these are not islands unto themselves. These plants are all, these organisms are all interconnected through a tightly woven web of connections that enable them to thrive. And when we disturb that, we disrupt the ecosystem. So here's the pool of water that looks like a bunch of leaves. Well, it turns out that 60% of the pool nutrients are provided for the organisms that live there. There's invertebrates that shred and graze, and detritivores that munch on things, and bacteria, and those organisms become then food for other organisms higher up in the food chain. And you have a pretty fancy web that develops. You have a dry spell when the terrestrial grazers are there, and then you also have a bunch of aquatic grazers when the water is filling up in the vernal pool, which is happening right now. So plants kickstart all of our complex food webs, almost without exception. And plants, as you know, take energy from the sun and make food and oxygen. And we all learned in 3rd grade that this is called photosynthesis, and it occurs in chloroplast. I can't tell you how many hikes and things I've gone on with people where they just don't even think about the plants. And think of it, they make food for us. Take the plants away, there's no ecosystem. Okay, so how do we conserve all of this? Well, when MNFI got started about 40 years ago, we had our 40th anniversary last year, or maybe it was the year before. We decided to put together a map of the natural communities, or the cover of the state, before widespread disturbance on the landscape. So, and then we thought, we'll go explore them and learn about them, and then we'll figure out how we can conserve them. So we put together this map. It took, I think, about 6 years of different people working for MNFI. And if you're wondering where this map comes from, it's the historical survey data. So when the European settlers came later, after the indigenous folks were here, they surveyed every square mile of the state, almost. Not every single square, but most of them. At each corner, they marked the trees and wrote descriptions. And our staff then translated those to community types. And this is the beautiful map that they created. And you can see that there are distinguishable communities there. The first thing you'll notice, of course, is the tension zone, where we have a lack of conifer component down in the southern part of the state. And moving north, we then pick that component up. And then if you look at each zone, you can see there, oops, and that's because the temperature gets cooler as you go further north. And then you can see there are characteristic communities in different parts of the state. Now, these are not all of them, but these are the things that characterize these particular areas for me. And down in your region, you are in the inner lobate, and that's where the lobes of the glaciers came. There was 3 lobes, 1 over here and 2 over here. And as they were receding, big chunks of ice broke off, and there was a lot of chaos. And so you have a lot of diversity in topography there. So the point is, species occur not just randomly, they occur because of what the glaciers left behind. Enormous volumes of meltwater sorted out sand and gravel. You had the formation of various landforms. And it's the landforms that determine the soils, which interacts with the climate, the topographic position, the hydrology, and natural processes on the landscape that form the different natural communities. So there's some flexibility in where things occur, but not a total flexibility. So I have a little trouble when I'm trying to imagine what's going to happen in climate change when you're not going to have a whole community just walk up and go north. You may have a species here and there. So it's going to be fascinating, whatever we get to see of it in our lifetime. I thought you might want to see the cover map for Kalamazoo County if you haven't seen it already. You can see there's a lot of pinks in here. This dark pink here is the Mesic Southern Forest that we just walked through. These lighter pinks are oak hickory forests. Those are drier. Those are fire dependent. So they germinate on bare ground, the seeds of oaks. And these lighter colors here are various forms of savanna or prairie. This is a black oak barren. These are sand prairies, and these other ones here, make sure I get it right, mixed oak savanna, looks like grassland, I guess, black, yeah. And then you can see there's little pockets of water, and then also these are lighter blue colors are shrub swamp. And then we even had some wet prairies in here, which are some of the coolest places in the state. So one thing you might want to do if you haven't done this already is kind of check this map out on our website, and then find where your property is and see how it fits into this landscape and compare what's there now to what could have been there in the 1800s. So those organized groups of animals and plants that occur across the landscape under similar environmental conditions are predominantly structured by natural processes. Those are what we refer to as the natural communities. And we use this as a coarse filter to try to conserve the biodiversity of all of those different ecosystems. So by conserving some of each of these, we'll conserve a whole bunch of species that are living within them. If you're interested, we have a well, it's not that new anymore. It's probably about 5 years old, the Field Guide to Natural Communities. It has beautiful descriptions with lists of species, some of the rare ones, the dominant ones, places you can visit to see a different community type. When I started with MNFI, this was a 4-page handout. So we've come a long way in learning about the cover of the state of Michigan. We also track the most vulnerable species in the state. These are the threatened, endangered, and special concern species. And we use this as a fine filter. So sometimes the coarse filter doesn't capture everything and some things fall through the cracks. And our goal as part of the conservation of biodiversity is try to catch some of those hot spots where there's species that are not captured under the natural community types. Now, we don't get to make the decision about what actually gets conserved. We just provide scientific information to help those decisions be made. So in the case of species, we want to encourage that we capture species where these vulnerable species will be most likely to sustain them. You don't want to just capture one that's probably going to get developed, or you want to try to find those ones that have the best chance of being sustained over time. There's one other part that is a part of biodiversity that we often forget about it. Anybody think of what that is? Well, that's genetic diversity, and it's critical to the whole puzzle of conservation. If you take away genetic diversity, you have no way to adapt to changing conditions. So genetic diversity is the raw material for adapting to new conditions, which we have to do all the time. And when you reduce the genetic diversity, the chances of destroying something completely because there's no way to adapt is very high. And it turns out, as you all probably know, that maintaining genetic diversity is much more challenging in fragmented landscapes because you have populations that get smaller and smaller and smaller. The gene flow from population to population is changed, and there could be catastrophic events to small populations where the genetic diversity is completely lost. So, of course, this is important when you're making your planting choices. But I want to go back a step and remind us that biodiversity is not about the number of things, the number of communities, the number of species. It's about connections. These species are co-evolved and adapted to their environment together. And when you take pieces out, it changes that web. And nobody knows exactly how far you can change the web before it collapses. So our mantra is to keep all the parts, connections, and processes as best we can, both the abiotic and biotic. And by doing that, we become more resilient to change. And that can be ever more important than right now as climate change looms in front of us. So why is it important for us to have intact functional ecosystems? They provide everything that we need to thrive on Earth. Food, fuel, medicine, they clean our air and water, they provide cultural services. A lot of people are finding this now during the pandemic to be extra important. Like the pollinators, nutrient cycling, and so forth. So in essence, diverse functional ecosystems sustain life on Earth. And that is my view of the context for why we do invasive species work. We're doing invasive species work because invasive species are threatening the biodiversity of our state and country and world. So step number one is to identify the most important places in your area, try to understand them and work to connect them. And if it's your own garden, that's an absolutely fabulous place to be doing that work. And I know that whether you consciously do it or not, you're all thinking about what's the composition, what's the structure and function, how can I make things work, and what are the processes that I need to sustain them. We need more of that. Because look at what we've done to our landscape. This is southern Michigan, and we've certainly changed things a lot. We have a lot of stressors, fragmentation, aquatic barriers, terrestrial barriers. We alter the hydrology. Climate change is interacting and changing the water levels, which is changing and impacting our ecosystems. We're putting nutrients in the water. There's pollution sources, and we stop natural processes in a lot of places. Now, we are making progress to changing some of these. We're taking dams out now, which is a fascinating thing to see. We're talking about, stopping the nutrients, but we have a lot of things that are going to take a while to fix. But the most recent threats are that of invasive species and climate change. They've become more mainstream. People are much more aware of them. And I don't have time to talk about both of them. That would be, a whole nother week, a year to try to figure out the influences, but they certainly do influence. There'll be winners and losers under climate change scenarios for various invasive species, and that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. So let's get on then to defining invasive species. We've talked about biodiversity, we've talked about their stressors. What is an invasive species? Well, let's go back to our woods. And remember, we found the spring flora there, and there's tons of other things as well. And what it takes is for a deer, a rabbit, a person, a bicycle to ride through that woods, drop the seeds of this plant to change the rules of existence for the associated species there. If the rules change too fast and they last a long time, there will be consequences for many species. And I think there are consequences for many species. So let's take a look. These are all species that have big impacts. What's going on with garlic mustard besides displacing species that were there before? It disrupts soil fungi that are required by some seedlings to germinate. So not good for forestry. Japanese barberry displaces ground flora, and it's very hard for organisms to move through there, the sharp, jagged thorns. Glossy buckthorn in almost every wetland throughout the state. Transpires water out and literally dries up the wetland. This is Grand River Fen in southeastern Michigan. If any of you know of that site, they've made remarkable progress on that. And here we have swallowwort, which tricks monarchs and kills their larvae, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Invasive species are simplifying our ecosystems. That erodes native biodiversity, and it seems to be happening quickly. If I just look around me in the amount of space that is now gobbled up by development and invasive species is amazing. There's hardly any wild places left. And it's happening in both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Parrot feather, I'll be showing you this later, European frogbit, yellow floating heart. We are finding, believe it or not, water hyacinth and water lettuce in our waters. We found several acres in the Detroit River. We don't know that it's overwintering. It's probably coming from people's gardens. But the thing is, it's in our waters. And over time, as climate shifts, that means they could become a problem. And I think there's nothing, the most predictive possibility about a plant being invasive is how it behaves somewhere else under the same conditions. And they spend billions of dollars down in the southern part of Florida dealing with these species. There are safety impacts. For example, Phragmites can get very dry and burn. They burn it on purpose in some places, controlled to try to prevent harm. There are infrastructure impacts. Everybody knows the story of Japanese knotweed. You can't buy a house with Japanese knotweed in England on it because it's such a destructive pest to infrastructure. There are aesthetic impacts. Who wants to live in places like this? And there are recreational impacts. Try riding your kayak through this frog bit. And by the way, this frog bit is so thick, it's in the entire water column, which depletes it of oxygen, and therefore no more fish can be in that spot. And then back to our swallowwort. This is not something that you would see unless you were looking for it. But the swallowwort is in the milkweed family. It has some of the same chemistry in the leaves, obviously not all of it, as you'll see. But it comes out earlier in the spring, like most of our invasive species. They have a head start in making energy. And the butterflies fly and see this plant first. They lay their eggs on it, but the chemistry of the plant, even though they're attracted to it, the larvae suffer higher mortality and don't typically survive. So that's kind of an indirect thing that you can't really just see by plants displacing one another. And I know you all know the story of Douglas Ptolemy bringing nature home. It turns out that most of our non-native plants are toxic to our native insect specialists, so therefore they're not providing food for them. And the mama bird that goes to look for, hundreds of trips a day to the specific caterpillar that their picky little babies need to survive has a much harder time finding that. And this is actually the compelling reason that I continue to work in invasive species. This is just mind-blowing to me, because every square foot of invasive plant that we are planting reduces the base of the food chain. That's a problem. Okay, so now we've talked about sort of the right-brained way of looking at invasive species. They cause big impacts to things that we desire. So which of these are invasive? Introduced species, non-indigenous species, exotic species, alien, or non-native? Got your vote down? These all mean the same thing. They have all been introduced to new areas on purpose or by accident. I don't know why we use so many different terms, but we do. But only some of these cause harm. And these are the ones that are the invasive species. So the definition in the legislation from Bill Clinton's era is that invasive species are non-native to the ecosystem under consideration and likely to cause harm to the economy, environment, and human health. And there is no official list that everybody agrees on. So it is a bit of a value judgment in terms of what is considered harm to some people and to others. So you need to decide what you consider harm and speak up about it. So are invasive species inherently evil? Well, we brought them here, many of them, for agriculture, erosion, wildlife, medicine, horticulture, aquaculture, organisms and trade, trading plants. That's where Japanese knotweed probably came from. And many things stow away on the boats and so forth. So we didn't know when we were bringing them that they were going to be a problem. Otherwise, why would we have done that? And they're coming now in a faster rate because we have many more global trade routes. Climate change will exacerbate that because there'll be some other trade routes that will open up as the ice melts. So it's likely that the rate in which these species arrive is going to get bigger. And so why are they so competitive? They have super duper reproduction and dispersal mechanisms. Garlic mustard can produce over 3,000 seeds per plant. Tons of seedlings in the spring. They're already up and flowering now. Buckthorn and many of the other woody shrubs that are from Europe and other places stump sprout. So if you cut that off, they'll just grow new shoots. Things like Japanese knotweed and Phragmites can grow from fragments of the rhizome and fragments of the stem in some cases. And then, as I said before, they often are able to green up sooner than our native flora, and they senesce later, which gives them almost a month more of energy than our native plants. So this gives them a competitive edge. Why some of them actually are invasive and some of them do not become invasive, that's another question. I do not know the answer to that. But once they're here, we have ways of spreading them through the nursery. There's lots of things that are still for sale that are considered by many to be invasive. On our boat trailers, on our horses, on our equipment, on our shoes. Birds transport all the buried ones, and all trails basically serve as vectors. So I ask you again, are they evil? Well, no, they're just plants, but they do all these things to our native ecosystems. And in my opinion, this reduces ecosystem resiliency. And that's why I continue to work at this problem. Every day, just about every day, I ask myself this question. Should we really be doing this? And I was talking to my colleague, Pete Badra. He's one of our aquatic ecologists. And he said, Phyllis, you can do something or you can do nothing. And so faced with that choice, I am still in the camp of, yes, we should be doing something. I may change my mind sometime, but it hasn't happened yet. But the caveat is, if we're going to do something, let's do it right. We know that invasive species are not everywhere. We can stop or slow uncommon ones we want to focus on the ones that are a real threat. And we can try to protect those places that are uninvaded and restorable. But not planning them is not the way to go, because you will make things worse. So we have to go then to the invasion curve that every single talk I go to on invasive species shows in some form or another. This one was made by Suzanne Campbell, who also helped write our field guides. She's an amazing botanist, ecologist. When an invasive species arrives in a new place, it has to get established and reproduce, or otherwise it will not become invasive. So that's the first step, the introduction. We never see this when it happens, unless by some fortune it lands on your front step. And then often there's a lag time before it starts to take off and reproduce. That can be a long time, 50, 60 years sometimes, even longer. And we don't necessarily know why in those cases. But those of us who are out there really looking for the things we're worried about may detect them as they start to become more abundant. But in reality, widespread awareness does not occur until it's already really, really difficult to control them, and it's very, very expensive. So this curve then can be used to implement strategies. So if we can focus our work down on the left end of the curve, on prevention, don't let the plants come to this country, stop them at the trade, stop the ballast water, stop them from moving site to site by cleaning your boots and equipment. But if they should get in and they're actually established, then you want to try to get to them early. And you want to focus on species that are really causing a problem wherever they are uncommon. So that means early detection for something like Chinese yam, which is in the southeast part of the state, but only a few occurrences are known. So every time you find that, you want to go respond to it. Now, that doesn't mean you do it quickly. It means that you go assess the situation and determine the best response. When you get down here to the other end of the curve, that's the hard part, because now you're talking about prioritizing. We never will have enough money to address everything we want to. There's absolutely no way. So we have to pick and choose. And what I'm suggesting, and I thank Ellen Jakert from the Nature Conservancy about this, we need to prioritize the most important places where we can be successful. Because if we can't be successful, you're wasting money and you should be doing something else. We don't always know that, so we sometimes have to design experiments, but we have to do it professionally. So in order to use any of these strategies, we first must know what the distribution of the invaders are. And when I started in 2003 working on invasive species, there was not a map in the state showing me the distribution of our plants that are invasive. And if you think about it, if you don't know what your target is, how are you going to hit it? So I went up in 2003 to do a map invasive species at Camp Grayling, where I got my start. My first job with Michigan Natural Features Inventory was doing a floristic inventory up in the Camp Grayling area. And so I was going around this time and I was mapping spotted knapweed. And you can see there's some big blotches here, highly disturbed areas where they're pretty much monocultures. You can see it's spreading along all the roads, and then there's these little outlying bigger infestations there. So what do I do with that? Where do I start? Well, because I did step number 1, which was identify the most important places, I now have a starting point. This is one of the highest quality pine barrens in the state. Pine barrens supports 4 or 5 different rare species, including the Kirtland warbler. It's not on this site here for the Kirtland warbler, but it's the same habitat. And so now I know where to focus, and I'm going to do a barrier right here and monitor that so that does not keep coming and encroach. I'm going to work on the roads, and I'm going to block all the outliers, because every time you spend working somewhere else, these smaller outliers are going to grow. So I'm going to start at the core and push my way out. So a good map allows you to make informed, explicit choices. Now here's a different scale map. This map is a little bit old, so it doesn't have all the counties, I believe, that Swallow Ward is in. But what's the outlier here? This would be considered an outlier. This is the source. So you want to nail all those populations up there, try to eradicate it, and then continue to push back towards the source. And in the areas in between, let's do prevention and early detection responses there. So you can see how a map can help you determine the ways that you can try to address invasive species most effectively. So the very first thing I did when we started working with the state to develop a state program was to work with Amos Ziegler of the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network. So he developed that. He's an entomologist at MSU and has a spatial database operation. And he does work with gypsy moth and other insect pests. And so what this allows you to do is put it on your phone, and you can report species when you're in the field. And we made it very simple on purpose, because there was already a half dozen mapping protocols that were not being used because they were too complicated. So all you need to do is select the species, you take a GPS point with your phone, you answer a drop-down menu for the size of the infestation, a drop-down menu for how dense it is, and then you take a photo. And then you send that off, and it goes into the central database and gets mapped. And then I can go in and look at it. You can request alerts for any species in any county in the state. So if I'm interested in Kalamazoo County and I want to know if somebody's found mile-a-minute weed there, I can tell the MISN folks to put me on the early alert. And when the next person who maps mile-a-minute weed, I will get an email in my inbox. You can look at distributions of any species that are in the system. And then this is really handy for those of you who are learning new invasive species. These are identification modules. I believe you browse the data and you'll find training. And they're designed to hone in on the characters that will distinguish these species, the most easy to determine characters. And then we also show you how the things that look like them that you might mistake them for, and they teach you how to avoid that mistake. So this is a wealth of information. We also developed these 2 booklets, and the information in these booklets forms the basis of the MISN data. So I hope you'll join if you're not already, and start mapping especially the ones that are really rare. That's what we need the most. And if you have any trouble learning how to do your app or have any technical issues, I highly recommend Claire Peterson. Claire has been with the program nearly since the beginning. Amos is the entomologist who started and developed the program with staff. And Claire does the technical aspects now. And I have yet to have her take longer than 5 minutes to get back to me when I call her. So she's, don't be shy. If you have any questions, you can also email me a question. Okay, so we did the biodiversity, we did what an invasive species is, and we talked about mapping. Really little bit about control. So the most important thing is to understand, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to do when you're trying to control plants? You're trying to stop them from coming and stop them from reproducing and dispersing. If they don't get here, you've done the job. If they get here and they can't reproduce and they can't disperse, then you've done the job. So that's your goal, is to try to figure out how they're dispersing, how they're reproducing, and how can you impact that. So unfortunately, we make mistakes all the time. People often just get real excited and they want to go out and nail something when they first learn about it. I don't have any idea what happened at the site. I just know I was driving by and I went, whoa, this is Japanese knotweed along US 23 north of Ann Arbor. And it looks like there might have been a fence here, and maybe that's a different property. So whoever treated this by cutting it, unless they sprayed it with herbicide, and then it wouldn't have even mattered, even if they had, because they haven't done this side. So the worst thing that can be done with Japanese knotweed is to cut it without treatment, because it can sprout from stem sprouts and from rhizome sprouts. So this is going to produce thousands of propagules that will continue to spread on that site unless it's taken care of. So understanding how this plant reproduces is critical to being able to control it. The control toolkit has many, many things in it, and there's probably more in here now. I haven't updated this particular slide for a while. But the goal is to figure out the combination of best techniques that will have the least negative impact. So if you don't have to use herbicide, that's great. Anything to minimize herbicides is fine by me. But sometimes judicious application of herbicide can be least disturbing because you can be effective right away. So it all depends upon the site, the biology of the plant, the weather, and so forth. One thing you have to remember is there's never a case, almost never a case, where it's one and done. You will have to anticipate follow-up. It's very rare to be able to nail something on the first try. And that's because plants have seed banks, birds fly, lots of reasons. So I'm going to just go through one example. This is our lovely Phragmites. What's missing from this picture? %80 of Phragmites is underground rhizomes. And this plant produces energy through photosynthesis all spring, summer, and fall, sends the energy all the way down into the roots to overwinter. So if you just treated this top part, you haven't even touched the plant. Oops, don't know what happened there. So a typical way of treating Phragmites is to use a wetland formulated glyphosate, because it's usually growing in water, in the fall, when the plant is sending its resources to the rhizomes. So then what it does is the glyphosate goes down with those resources and gets to the root and starts to kill it. So you're basically using the plant to translocate the herbicide. And if you don't kill the rhizome, it'll grow right back. After you've done the treatment, next year, you want to try to burn it, mow it, get rid of the dead biomass. If they're small infestations, they may not need to be treated much, but if it's a massive infestation like this, you want to get that biomass out of there so it opens up and you can see the new resprouts that will inevitably be there, and then you can effectively treat them in year 2. You need to document what you did. You need to conduct pre and post monitoring so that you can see if what you're doing is actually working, and then repeat that as long as is needed. And then, of course, it's really important to share your results so that other people can learn from what you did. So this is an example of learning about the biology, understanding the need for the tools that we have, and following up with multiple techniques. Ideally, if we could get Phragmites controlled to a level where individual landowners could just treat small reed sprouts in their land, that would be pretty cool. And there are some places where we're starting to get there up in Saginaw Bay, but we have a long way to go. So I just want to emphasize, this is one example. Every site is different, and every site requires its own assessment to determine what you need to do. So if you get to the point where you're going to be treating, I highly recommend you talk with people who have treated this plant before. I would go beyond our state if you don't feel comfortable that you found anyone. There's many of the plants that we have are already invasive other places, and you can learn from what they have to tell you. And if you've done a good job, you can be successful. This is a Putz Park up in Saginaw Bay, really dense stand of Phragmites, and this was after the first year treatment. And presumably they've gone back for every year since then. I think it was about 3 years ago when this happened, and I'm going back to work up there. We're going to fill in some gaps, and we got a big grant to treat a contiguous, I think it's like 500 contiguous acres of Phragmites up there. Go back and finish the job. Okay, so let's take a look what's happening at the state level. So it was 2003 when I did that map up at Camp Grayling, which is to try to help us figure out how to get a mapping done. We got the mission going. In 2009, I wrote a plan for DNR Wildlife Division to deal with invasive plants. And this was the first plan of its kind in the DNR. Even though invasive species is cited as the second biggest threat, there wasn't hardly any staff that were dedicated to it. So this was the start of getting things moving along. And it was sponsored by Mark Sargent, space there, and Sue Tangora. So I really appreciate the opportunity to work on this. And MNFI wasn't thinking about it either. Like I said, I remember going back to sites and going, oh my goodness, these are invaded by invasive species. What are we gonna do? So while we were on the ground then, we went around the state, conducted strategic planning meetings with groups of people, often the conservation districts and their partners. We did training on identification and how to do successful control and how to build a SISMA, which these were then called cooperative weed management areas. And that came from the west where they started out in the ranges when the ranges were being invaded. While we were doing that, there was an intensive statewide planning and collaboration work going on. They formed a terrestrial core team and an aquatic core team, and they meet regularly. They include all the different divisions of the DNR and Eagle, so you have a cross-pollination amongst all the players. And from 2003 when I started to write the plan to 2009, the stars finally aligned in 2014. And the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Programs was started. And I remember sitting in the pub waiting for Governor Schneider to announce it. And I think it was like the last 3 minutes of his speech when he said this money was available. And that year, $7.6 million in state funding was distributed to weed management areas. And now approximately $6 million is distributed annually. These are competitive funds. They're based on strong priorities that mirror the stuff we've just been talking about. But every year they have different focal areas. Some funds are always designated for SISMAs, which are now the new name for a cooperative weed management area. This is cooperative invasive species management area. So they can now include animals. But anyway, but regardless, this little pot that's for them is still competitive. So they have to write grants every year in order to do one of the biggest jobs in the state for natural resources. And I would really like to see that changed, but I'm thankful that we have this money. So what they're really trying to do though, as this is a wicked problem, nobody has all the answers. They're really trying to find innovations that help us move the needle on controlling invasive species instead of just chasing our tail. So if you have any good ideas, please share them. You have just as much opportunity to write a proposal for this grant source as anybody. We now have cooperative invasive species management areas throughout the entire state. They've changed a little bit back and forth. You guys are part of the BCK SISMA with Fallon Januska. And these are interjurisdictional partnerships because we know invasive species don't follow anybody's boundaries. So we're all working together to try to combat a common problem, and that is the spread of invasive species. And there is a lot of strategic action going on. It's pretty amazing how quickly this came together. We also developed the Michigan Invasive Species Coalition, and this is an advisory team that was formed to support and guide the groundwork of the SISMAs. These are the people currently that are sitting on the team. Sue Tangora and other people from DEQ were involved, and they stepped back, and now it's a few people from DNR. These are assigned invasive species positions now, and the missing folks, and then we have representative of all the SISMAs. Not every SISMA is represented, but they are part of the team. We have an annual conference every year to share different activities, resources, to bond with one another and help improve management efforts. And then we also have a website supporting all of these different initiatives. And it's also a place where there's a forum where you can deposit information and you can talk and ask questions and exchange information. And you can also get to the Missing app on that website. Sue Tangora and I started an aquatic invasive plant early detection response back in, oh gosh, don't remember the year. And because there was a handful of species that were already known to be high priority, big impact species that nothing was being done about. And we were able to get a grant that started an early detection program that has now been taken over by Eagle, formerly DEQ. And so they focus on their watch list species and help coordinate responses with partners. And they have a story map where this is on their website, but this is a little diagram showing where they've worked so far. So the species they focus on are European frogbit, yellow floating heart, water clover, parrot feather, water hyacinth, and water lettuce. We're also working with MDOT and county road commissions. In fact, I just gave a presentation in mid-April to the MDOT folks. Since roads are such an important corridor where species are being distributed, the understanding of how they're spreading needs to be communicated so that the road maintenance doesn't spread species, but controls them. So lots of good relationships going on there. So I think there's two big areas that we need to improve on, and this is kind of a new thing for me because I've been so focused on, conservation areas, places, and I'm starting to realize they're far and few between. We need, if we're gonna withstand climate change and invasive species, we need to use all of the state of Michigan. So I think we need to increase our green infrastructure and connectivity in both corporate and urban areas by expanding native communities or restoring them. Planting wild gardens everywhere we can. Every native garden, large and small, is critical to the overall success of biodiversity conservation. They help mitigate invasive species impacts, as you all know really well. And this is, this is happening now for real. I hope that we can become leaders using carrots, not sticks, to try to encourage other people to plant wild gardens as well. And according to Douglas Talmy, planting even just 30% of your yard can make a difference for those insects that are at the base of the food chain. And as you all know, local genotypes are important still. They are more likely to be adapted to your conditions and not disrupt the ecosystem connections that your gardens and other places have. This is going to get complicated though, because I was talking to Bill Schneider, one of the growers, and finding genetic diversity is challenging these days because so much land is being developed. So we need more people working on this problem. And I appreciate that many of you probably are doing this already. So I just found this map. It's a little bit old, but this is a current cover map of, instead of the circa 1800 map of Oakland County. You can, not Oakland, I'm sorry, Kalamazoo County. And you can see there's a lot of places that aren't wild anymore. And I was just thinking, well, just imagine as this movement takes off, as individual gardeners plant their wild spots, places for insects to step from one place to the next. It would just be so dramatic and so exciting. And it's happening bit by bit, happening in Detroit. So things that you can do to promote biodiversity and slow down invasions. Get to know the communities in your area and understand them. Look out for the high threat species and report them to missing. That helps the people doing the work know how to make better decisions. Get outside and enjoy the world, but don't bring invasive propagules with you. Learn how to safely collect native seeds so you don't deplenish populations, so you can help with restorations. I'm sure many of you already are growing native plants. Don't forget to use the weed-free mulch. I'm sure you all heard about what were they, mothballs with zebra mussels that got spread around. And then educate others about the importance of native plants. I think that those are all important things to be doing. So I envision a future where the best examples of our diverse native ecosystems are, we fortify them, we expand them, and we connect them and across all ownerships. So that's my lofty goal. Here's a lot of resources for you. I'll make this presentation available to you if any of these, you want to look back at these references where you can find out more information. And now it's time for the pop quiz. Do we have time?
Sure.
Okay, all right. Everybody ready? I took all the hard ones out. This is Japanese stiltgrass. It's just been found recently in, I forget which county it is now, but it's somewhere near your area, maybe a little further south. It has a white mid stripe. It's really reflective hair. It's a little offset from the center, so it's very distinctive. It grows on top of itself, looking like there's stilts here. It is a flowering plant, believe it or not, and it reproduces by seed primarily. This is what happens when it gets going. It's mostly a southern species, but you can see it's starting to move into Michigan. So keep your eyes peeled for that. This is what we call a compound pinnately divided basal leaf. So this is a pin going up the middle, and the leaves are coming across opposite or pinnate from one another. It's the only basal leaf in this family that looks like that, as far as I know. That is wild parsnip. I don't know if it's much of a problem yet down where you are. I think there's occurrences in Kalamazoo County, but it's not as common as it is other places in the state. And it literally lines the roads. This is related to hogweed, giant hogweed. And so it has some of the same toxins that can, when they interact with your skin and the sun, can cause blisters and burning. It's not as bad as hogweed, but it can be pretty bad. You always want to look for clues. So the only thing that you can see here is that these are opposite leaves and it has entire margins. So that means it's a few things that are not, could be like that. I probably would have walked right by this without knowing it until I learned it. This is what becomes our swallowwort. Black swallowwort is more common, and you can see the petals are more equal width and length. And here's the pale swallowwort, which is a little bit less common in the state, and it has a much longer, narrow, different color tone. This is the one that's in the milkweed family, and of course the seeds can spread that way. And here's what an infestation looks like. And this one isn't even climbing yet. And here's what a bad infestation looks like if it's not taken care of. Well, let's see what we can say about this one. This one has distinctly lobed leaves. It's a vine and it produces a little tuber, which is what it reproduces by, as well as the shoots from the underground rhizomes. This is Chinese yam. Little bit of uncertainty about the taxonomy, so I've seen all these different names, scientific names for it.
I think maybe in the interest of time too, we should go to some questions after this.
Okay. Alrighty. Just let you know then that there is one bindweed that looks a lot like it, but you can see how the lobes are very different. If I want to just scoot ahead to one plant that I think everybody needs to know, then this one. Very unusual leaf. There's the plant. This is the first Michigan confirmation of this species at Albion College in Michigan. It's kind of a spindly little thing. The triangular leaves. It has these big ochrae, which are characteristic of the buckwheat family. They're at the base of the flowers as well. If you look up close, there's big thorns along the stem, so it doesn't look that bad until you touch it, and it's really bad. And they're also on the underside of the leaves. This is what the flowers look out. They're terminal. They're bright blue berries, and each one encloses a glossy back seed. And here's a mess of this. If you put your hand in there, you'd come out bleeding. And it forms impenetrable vines like this and basically kills the things underneath it, similar to Oriental bittersweet, although this is herbaceous. And I have not seen it actually, except in this form. I went there in October. And you can see even in October, the fruits were still there. And when we took those off, those black seeds were on the plant still. So this plant has had 2 years to seed, building up a seed bank. And my hope is that with a dedicated effort, we can detect this wherever it is and actually have it be one of our first eradications in the state. This is what it looks like. It actually is kind of distinctively orange. And here's the distribution. So you can see this is quite a shift over into Michigan. So it gets kind of discouraging thinking about all of these species and what to do about them, but I encourage you to think of it this way. It's not about killing evil plants. It's about protecting important ecosystems and processes that sustain life on Earth. So people protect what they know and love. Keep taking your friends to wild places so they will know to come to love them. And that's the way that we will keep the sum greater than its parts. Thanks for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. And yeah, that's a great perspective to leave us with. We're protecting the places that we love. And we do have a couple of questions here. One was, how important is it to burn native plants or invasive plants like garlic mustard after you remove them, just to make sure they're dead?
It depends upon the species. Garlic mustard, if you pull garlic mustard when it's in flower and you don't do anything with it, it can actually go to seed. So most people actually put it in the landfill. You're allowed to package it up as an invasive plant and do that. If you have a way to burn it, that's okay. It does depend upon the species. Some plants you can let dry out. So it's species specific.
Okay. Is there a good source like to tell you how you should dispose of these things, or?
Yeah, I know I can send that around. There are some disposal guidelines that Eagle has put together, and I can get those and send that around to you.
That'd be great. We can put them on our website.
Okay.
I've been using a herbicide on Chinese yam for years, but by the time I see it, it's already produced seeds and they're dropping. Is there a better way to control it than straight herbicide?
To be honest with you, I've not worked with that plant, so I don't know where. Is this in Michigan?
Yes.
No. Have you talked with the SISMA person that's in your county?
I'm not sure with this person if they have.
Okay.
Last year, and we were using iNaturalist just for them to document plants to learn some diversity. And he took a picture of one in some neighborhood here in Kalamazoo, and someone from Van Buren Conservation contacted him and said, where is this? I need to go look.
Ah, Well, send me an email, and I'd love to follow up with you and see how we can help with that. I'd be curious because there's not that many occurrences, and so if you're having a lot of trouble, then it'd be good to get some conversations going around that.
Mm-hmm. And you're going to send some sources, good sources for ID. Somebody's asking about ID and control methods. So in the resources that you send us.
Yep. So what I recommend for the identification is to go on to the MISN website and look under training, or just surf through the top titles and you'll find it. And we have, I think, over 30 modules on there which go through detailed characteristics of the plants. They're short and easy, but they direct you right into the important areas. So I'd recommend that first of all. You can also look at our field guide online if you want, or you can purchase it. So those resources will be in this presentation.
Great. And this one might be outside of invasive plants, but somebody's wondering about, if you're planting native plants or seeds, but the source is like not Michigan genotype, it's outside of the state.
Yeah, I guess I just listened to a webinar about that because nobody knows the answer to that for sure. There's two concerns. One is inbreeding depression, and then the other is outbreeding depression. So the concern is that if you bring a genotype that's too far removed from your local genotype, that it could swamp the genotype, or it could simply die and you've wasted your money. Most professionals that I talk to still who grow native plants, the closer the better. I think I would defer to somebody from one of the growing to see what their latest recommendation is, but the closer the better. I don't think maybe if it's just over the border, it's going to make a difference. But if it's like, 500 miles, that's probably different than 100 miles.
Okay. Is nutsedge considered invasive?
It's not hit the big time for me. I've seen it. It's problematic. It's annoying, but I honestly haven't looked at anything that's talked about. I haven't really researched that plant. One thing to be remember, I said it was about values, so you get to decide what's invasive, to be honest, where you are. If it's harming something that you're trying to work with, and it's on your property, then that can be considered invasive to you. And there's no reason that a native plant can also be invasive, even though it's not in the official legislation.
Notice that.
Yeah, because but typically when it's going awry, it's because the natural disturbances have been disrupted. So it's in a disrupted system, which is why it's not behaving as it normally would.
Somebody has a question about bishop's weed. Any guidance on controlling that?
I think you can actually hand pull that. You're talking, is that gout weed?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think that you probably can hand pull that.
Just got to be persistent. It's been my experience. Like it keeps coming back.
Well, it does, and every plant does. That's why this is such a difficult problem. There's no silver bullet for anything.
And any guidance on crown vetch? That's my nemesis at the moment.
Well, what are you trying?
I've tried hand pulling and I've tried herbicide.
What herbicide did you use?
It was Roundup.
Okay. I'm not a control expert by any means, so I'm sorry I'm not able to answer these control questions because I don't do that part of it. But I would talk with your SISMA coordinator and see, and I'll do some research on that one too. So crown vetch, what was the other one?
Bishop's weed.
Gout weed, okay.
And then Chinese yam.
Chinese yam,
okay. Okay. I think I'll turn it over to Jessie to close things out. Thank you so much again, Phyllis.
Yeah, thank you all.
Phyllis, thank you so much for such a great presentation. I especially loved your statement about it's about protecting what you love and what's important to you and values. I think that's very important in these days. I want to thank everyone that joined us tonight. If you have time, please visit us at KalamazooWildOnes.org. There you will find resources, but most importantly, there's also a tab that is for our plant sale. Our plant sale is currently going on. You can go ahead and order plants all the way up to, I believe, up to May 15th, with pickup time the following week, Friday and Saturday. Also, just wanted to remind everyone of our next event, which is May 26th, how utility rights of way and their management can support native plants and pollinators, by Ashley Bennett. With that, I want to thank everyone again for joining us, and please consider joining Wild Ones. You can also find that link on our website. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anne, for moderating. Thank you, Paul, for your time in introducing Phyllis. And once again, thank you, Phyllis, for such a great presentation.
Thank you so
Good
much
night,
for having
everyone.
me.